I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, let's talk about John Kerry's stepson and his ties to Hunter Biden, who is the son of Joe Biden, and Ukraine, and the infamous now, Burisma deal that was going down in Ukraine, in East Ukraine, in the Donbass, and Hunter Biden's involvement there. And John Kerry's stepson, Christoforou Heinz, I believe, his involvement with John Kerry and their mutual friend. I believe actually David Archer was Christoforou Heinz's roommate at university, and he's involved in this this unfolding story. Take us into what's going on here. We've done videos in the past of covering Hunter Biden, Burisma, Joe Biden, and what went on in Ukraine, and the money that appears to have been laundered via the IMF into Ukraine, back to these elites. I mean, all kinds of nefarious stuff was going on in Ukraine during a very tense time between Ukraine and Russia and the war in East Ukraine. So, Alexander, take us into this story.
Indeed. As you rightly say, Alex, we've done programs about this in the past, and I think we need to explain a little bit again of what we said in the past to provide context to all of this. Now, as we all know, in 2014, there was a change of government in Ukraine, brought about as a result of what I have no hesitation in calling an armed coup, backed by the United States, which overthrew the democratically elected president of the country, President Viktor Yanukovych, and which brought to power the Maidan government, which eventually came to be led by Poroshenko, Petro Poroshenko, who was until very recently president of Ukraine, until he was voted out of office, in fact, in April of this year. And what happened during this entire period of this transfer of power from, as I said, the democratically elected government of Yanukovych to the coup-appointed government, if you like, which came eventually to be led by Poroshenko, was that the man who was in charge of US policy towards Ukraine was Joe Biden, who was at that time the vice president of the United States. He was very, very actively involved in all which was going on at that time in Ukraine. I can remember how he was regularly telephoning President Yanukovych, the democratically elected President Yanukovych, to prevent him or to dissuade Yanukovych from ordering a crackdown on the anti-government protesters in Kiev. And I can also remember the very active role he played in helping the new pro-American government that was installed after this violent coup to consolidate power. In fact, as I said, he was the US's point man, key decision maker on all questions relating to Ukraine throughout the period of the Obama administration, right up until 2016. And I can also remember, by the way, him coming to Ukraine and making an absolutely extraordinary speech criticizing Ukraine's internal politics and at the same time saying unbelievably rude things about Russia's President Vladimir Putin during that whole period. So Biden was, to all intents and purposes, the person pulling the strings in Ukraine. He was the, shadow ruler of Ukraine in the United States, operating through this government which the United States engineered and brought into power through this coup. Now, what subsequently became known is that his son, Hunter Biden, who has a checkered history, and became, in the spring of 2014, directly after the coup, a member of the board of a Ukrainian company called Burisma Holdings, which was heavily involved in Ukraine's energy sector. And he made, as it turns out, millions upon millions of dollars out of this arrangement, which we have never really found out the whole truth about. So we have this strange situation where Joe Biden, the US vice president, is in effect running things in Ukraine on behalf of the United States, and his son, Hunter Biden, is in Ukraine, or at least has a commercial operation going in Ukraine, despite the obvious conflict of interest that seems to create between his father's, Joe Biden's, public duties and Hunter Biden's private commercial ones. And we have pointed out on previous videos that this arrangement, to all external appearances, has a very, very dodgy, even possibly a corrupt look about it. Now, what we have now learnt is that there was someone at the time who appears to have thought the same. And this is Christopher Heinz, who is the son-in-law of the then Secretary of State of the United States, John Kerry.
Stepson.
That's right, stepson, correct, stepson. Christopher Heinz, had up to that point been a business associate in a private with Hunter Biden. They'd owned a private equity firm together. Anyway, when Heinz learned that Hunter Biden was becoming involved in Ukraine in this way, and moreover doing so alongside a mutual friend called Devon Archer. Devon Archer was a former roommate of Christopher Heinz when they were at university, but he went with Hunter Biden to Ukraine, and they both seem to have got involved with Burisma Holdings and were both making money out of Ukraine. Christopher Heinz became very concerned. He reported about this to the State Department, which is, of course, headed by his stepfather, John Kerry. He sent an email saying that he was concerned about the situation and about what Hunter Biden was up to. And then subsequently, as it turns out, he severed all further business connections with Hunter Biden. So we have been saying on the Duran that there is something deeply troubling about this arrangement of Hunter Biden's in Ukraine at the same time that his father, Joe Biden, was running the US's Ukrainian policy. And this looked like a very obvious conflict of interest and gave every appearance, frankly, of being a frankly unhealthy and even corrupt arrangement. And it now turns out that someone who was in a position to know at the time, Christopher Heinz, the stepson of John Kerry, at the time thought the same and took immediate steps to distance himself from Hunter Biden and to alert the State Department and presumably his own stepfather, John Kerry, of what was going on. So it seems to me that here we have further evidence of the Ukrainian connection, which we have talked about on many occasions in our programs. I mean, the Ukrainians were heavily involved in supporting Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election. It turns out they had very close connections with prominent Democrats, Joe Biden and obviously Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. There seems to have been this revolving door, as you said, between people in the United States and Ukraine, with all sorts of people, Hunter Biden, Paul Manafort, coming to Ukraine, making lots of money, laundering it, sending it back to the United States. It all seems like a very, very dubious arrangement. And we've been speculating about this. So have other people like John Solomon at the Hill. And now we have the first evidence that people were worried about it at the time in the various steps that Christopher Heinz was taking at this very specific point in time when he was complaining about all of this to his stepfather and to the State Department, and severing his business connections with Hunter Biden.
It's huge. It's huge because it shows that you had, the secretary, the former Secretary of State's stepson, essentially, extremely worried as to the activity that was going on between Hunter Biden and Devon Archer in Ukraine. And, my guess is that he consulted with his stepfather, and they logged this complaint with the State Department in order to cover their backs.
I think that's exactly what happened. I mean, that's exactly what it looks like to me. I think it's worth pointing out that John Kerry and Christopher Heinz are immensely wealthy people who would have had no reason, obviously, to make themselves even richer by getting involved in Ukraine, and who clearly were very, very concerned about what was going on with the Bidens, about Biden's role in Ukraine, Joe Biden's role in Ukraine, and Hunter Biden's role in Ukraine. And as you correctly said, this email, which has now been made public, was clearly circulated to the State Department in order to make it absolutely clear that John Kerry and Christopher Heinz had no part in any of this. And I think that in itself tells an awful lot about this whole story. Alex, we've discussed this many times, the Ukrainian side of all of this, of what was going on in the Obama administration and in the run-up to Russiagate, has never been properly investigated. But like you said, I think it's huge.
One quick question: was it not was there not an effort to try and investigate this in Ukraine by one of the special prosecutors, and Joe Biden squashed it by having that prosecutor fired? In which case, we also have video evidence of Joe Biden at some conference, I believe, bragging about it. Is that not true?
You are absolutely right.
And we have that video evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm glad you brought it up because you're absolutely right. We have that video evidence. I mean, Joe Biden, let me be very clear about this. Between 2014 and 2016, he was the person who, more than anyone else, was pulling the strings in Ukraine. I mean, whatever he said to the Ukrainians had to do, because it was the United States that engineered the Maidan government's assumption of power, and it was the United States which, in effect, was calling the shots in Ukraine. And the person who was in charge of that policy was Joe Biden himself. And he moved to get the prosecutor, the Procurator General of Ukraine, who was potentially investigating his son, sacked, accusing this man of corruption. And as you absolutely rightly said, he bragged about it. He bragged about it in this extraordinary speech, which I mentioned, in which, of course, he also criticized Vladimir Putin. And I mean, this is, the game that is constantly being played here, which is the bait and switch. You act against people in Ukraine who seem to be working against you, working against your interests, potentially investigating your own son, and then at the same time you focus attention instead. You try to focus attention instead by launching all this extraordinary attack against Vladimir Putin, who of course has nothing to do with any of all of this. But it's the classic tactic that the Democrats have been following for years. I mean, it didn't start with Russiagate. This happened even before.
And it's classic Biden to make these kinds of gaffes. I mean, instead of keeping his mouth shut about what was going on in Ukraine, he gets up at a conference and he sits there and he brags about the fact that he squashed an investigation into his son and he got that prosecutor fired. I mean, he was a typical dumb Biden.
Well, it was stupid and very
Yeah.
dumb, but it also shows, again, the extraordinary sense of impunity of these people, because all of this was going on at a time when I think the Democrats were pretty sure that Hillary Clinton would become president of the United States. I mean, this is well before the 2016 election, but you could see that the ground was already being prepared to make a president of the United States. So they didn't think they had anything to fear, and they were able. What he was actually doing, what Joe Biden, it seems to me, was doing by that speech, by bragging in that way, is he was warning and threatening anybody in Ukraine, you don't mess with me and with my son and with the other people who are involved with the United States, because if you do, we get you fired.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
what it looks like to me.
Exactly. And a couple more questions, Alexander, as we unravel this story, which I think will haunt Biden. There's no way Biden will be president of the United States with this hanging over his head. No chance. Alexander, Christine Lagarde, who is now the is going to become the ECB head, was in charge of the IMF. She was funneling billions upon billions of euros, dollars to Ukraine, going against the IMF. Correct me if I'm wrong here, if I'm misstating this, going against the IMF charter or the IMF rules to get money into Ukraine. And this money was essentially, for lack of a better word, disappearing. Correct?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. Can I just explain this? I mean, Ukraine owes £3 billion dollars of debt to Russia. Russia is a member of what is called the Paris Club. It's a privileged creditor in IMF terms. IMF rules say that if a country is in default to a member of the Paris Club, the IMF cannot lend to that country. Ukraine is in default on that loan to Russia. The IMF accepts that loan is covered by Paris Club rules, and yet the IMF has continued to lend money to Ukraine despite that default. It's a clear-cut violation of the IMF's own rules. And of course, it was Christine Lagarde who engineered it. She was, as you correctly say, funneling. It's up to $25 billion is the total loan package of funds to Ukraine. And again, it's all a revolving door. Money, a lot of money has disappeared. The Ukrainians say that $8 billion has vanished. And apparently there's talk about Poroshenko being put on trial for disappearing some of it. And who knows who else was involved. And of course, we see that people, I don't know what Hunter Biden's actual role was, but we see all of these people in Ukraine, or these American carpetbaggers, if you like, coming to Ukraine, making lots of money, coming back to the United States within, at the same time that the United States, through the IMF, of which, by the way, the United States is the major shareholder and major financial provider, is in effect funneling money into Ukraine. So you have US tax dollars going via the IMF into Ukraine, with every appearance now that all that money was then being laundered through Ukraine and ending up back in the United States.
Yeah, ending up in companies like Burisma Holdings,
well, exactly.
At a time when the IMF and EU money and euros, at a time when the IMF and the European Union was putting the screws on Greece. They were closing and raiding Cypriot banks. They were imposing austerity on Italy. They were imposing austerity on Ireland. They were imposing austerity in Portugal. They were imposing austerity in Spain. And $25 billion, Alexander, was going to Ukraine only to be sucked up by Hunter Biden and Devin Archer and all these guys. Give me an effing break.
Well, I did. Well, there you go. I mean, you put it very well, Alex. I mean, perhaps it's important to say we haven't got all the details, but
my opinion. This is my opinion.
Obviously, Christopher Heinz's opinion also. We don't know everything that Christopher Heinz knew and Christopher Heinz thought, but he was clearly very worried, and he said, "I don't want to have anything to do with this. This isn't something I want to be involved in." So he arranges for this email to be sent to the State Department, and he arranges subsequently to have all business connections, as I said, with Hunter Biden and Devon Archer broken off. So, I mean, that's what these latest disclosures prove.
That leads to my final question, Alexander, to you. And I think I know the answer. I think you're going to know the answer right away. Why was this made public now? Is it a fear that this is going to come back and resurface as Biden runs for the presidency of the United States, and this was outed to the public in order to once again cover John Kerry and Christopher Heinz? Why is all of this coming to the public forefront now? I mean, 4 years removed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very good question. I mean, as I understand it, a lot of this arose out of investigations done by an organization called Citizens United, which is a conservative non-profit group. They've been digging into all of this, and it's obvious target. They're trying to find out the kind of things that the Bidens were up to. And this is where it's, some of this unpacking has come from.
But Kerry covered his ass. I mean, Kerry and Sunday covered their ass.
But having said that, Citizens United can do all the investigating, but somebody has to have made the decision to provide this information and this specific email. And I mean, you've got to ask this question: is it either the Kerrys saying to themselves, "Well, look, this is the moment where we now have to start disclosing these things because the net is closing on the Bidens," or maybe it is the Bidens doing a preemptive strike? I don't think it's the second, actually, because I think if the Bidens were behind these kind of leaks, then I think they would have done this in a different way, because what this is doing is it's only inviting more questions. I mean, this is just one thing that it shows that one other person, Christopher Heinz,
there you go,
was worried about this. And that inevitably leads to further questions. Why was he worried? Whereas, as I said, I think if it's the Kerrys who are disclosing all of this, which seems to be much more plausible, then one can see why. Because they're saying to themselves, the Bidens are going to go down. We're going to make absolutely sure that we don't go down with them.
Distance ourselves, yeah.
Exactly.
Distance ourselves from it, absolutely.
Exactly.
And I think at this point, it's obvious that they're trying to hide Biden, Joe Biden, from even speaking in public, and Biden is trying to hide Hunter Biden as well because of Hunter Biden's incredibly sketchy past. I mean, the guy's got so many skeletons in his closet, it's beyond belief. So they're trying to hide him as well in a way. I mean, the campaign strategy of the Bidens, like you perfectly said, is not to disclose and get ahead of information. It's more like to hide as much as they can and kind of push Biden over the finish line somehow.
That's exactly what I feel about this. I mean, as you correctly said, he is a gaffe merchant. I mean, he sort of pours out gaffes all the time. So you keep him as, and I mean, there's even, as I understand it, suggestions that he's getting a bit too old for this sort of thing, and his mind isn't all there, which I would have thought was a problem in itself, but that's another story. But I mean, keep him off the TV, keep him off questions, hide Hunter Biden with his alcohol and drugs problems in the past and his business dealings and his Ukrainian things.
China as well,
exactly. Put them all to one side, and as I said, conjure up this great story of Joe Biden, the vice president of the great Barack Obama, and basically try and float past the finishing line on essentially Obama's coattails, because that's what it all seems to me that it amounts to. I mean, Biden seems to be running his campaign. I speak now from Britain, and I mean, you have more perhaps of a feel from this than me, but it seems to me that he's basically running as Obama's, the person who will restore, the great Obama era. And that seems to me what it's all about. And obviously it appeals still to some people in the Democratic Party. But as we see, there are all these skeletons lying around. And I can't help but think that before very long, especially if the Democrats are unwise enough to nominate Joe Biden as their candidate, all these skeletons are going to come pouring out. I mean, contrast this, by the way, with Donald Trump, if I may say so. I mean, one of the amazing things about Donald Trump, I mean, I am even personally surprised about this, is how, in the end, there weren't any skeletons there. He wasn't involved with the Russians. He didn't evade taxes. He doesn't seem to have been involved in any corrupt dealings. If he had been, we'd have found out about them. And I mean, the only thing they could find is that he might have had some kind of relationship with two women. I mean, contrast that with what the Bidens have been up to, and the contrast is astonishing.
Even the biggest scandal to have hit the Trump campaign, i.e., Manafort, comes out of Ukraine. So that entire Maidan, there's so much dirt and corruption underneath the carpet of what was going on in Maidan during the Obama years. That, I mean, it's absolutely infuriating. Well, at the same time, you had a meltdown of, countries in Europe that were being, just pillaged by these institutions that were funneling money into Ukraine. I mean, it's absolutely infuriating.
Well, absolutely. And I'm very glad you mentioned Paul Manafort, because, of course, the point about Paul Manafort, as we have explained many times in our videos, and is now, by the way, acknowledged, is that whilst he was in Ukraine working as an advisor for President Viktor Yanukovych, he was working on behalf of the United States. The United States at that time was led by Barack Obama, who was the president of the United States. Joe Biden was Obama's vice president. So Paul Manafort and Joe Biden must have been working together in Ukraine. It cannot have been otherwise, given that Joe Biden was the person within the US government under Obama who was overall charge of the administration's Ukrainian policy. So to the extent that Paul Manafort was involved in corruption in Ukraine, he was involved alongside the Bidens. Nothing to do with Donald Trump at all.
Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click on the notifications bell to make sure you get notifications every time we push out a new video. And you can get a copy of this video in audio format. Follow us on iTunes and Soundcloud. The links are in the description box down below. And please donate to the Duran via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. That really helps out the channel a lot. And you can find those links in the description box down below as well. And of course, another way you can help the channel a whole lot is if you go to the Duran shop and pick up some of our merchandise. We've got ebooks on Russiagate. We've got an ebook on Brexit. We've got polos like the polo that Alexander is wearing right now with the embroidered eagle. We've got magic mugs. We've got t-shirts like what I'm wearing, Alexander. Duran shop, ebooks, merchandise.
Ebooks, amazing ebooks. I mean, we cover in them Russiagate, we cover Brexit, we cover all of these topics in extreme clarity and thoroughness. If you want to understand these very complicated subjects, Brexit and Russiagate. Go to our ebooks which explain it. We have been ahead on both stories. We have consistently got it right, both on Russiagate and on Brexit. And the reason we get it right is because we drink from magic mugs like these, which are 15 ounces, beautiful porcelain, incredibly refreshing, immensely mind enhancing. They enable us to get through the long watches of the night and the day, poring over articles, absorbing massive mountains of facts. And of course, I drink at this particular moment, I'm drinking Iron Goddess of Mercy tea from this one, which is one of China's great teas. And this is a phenomenal mug. It's got the Russian state symbol there, which is the double-headed eagle, different from our own double-headed eagle, which you see embroidered on my marvelous polo shirt. And what a beautiful polo shirt this is. Marvelous color. I should say it's got the flag, the colors of the Greek flag, which is very suitable because it's blue and white, and what a perfect combination of colors that is. It's the sky, the colors of the sky, and you can see there's our double-headed eagle there. There's this beautiful polo shirt, 100% cotton, incredibly comfortable to wear in all sorts of weathers, incredibly stylish to wear in all sorts of places. You are the very definition of smart casual when you wear something like this. And the feedback we're getting on our merchandise from our shop is phenomenal. And you go to the shop, you'll find that there's plenty of mugs like this. There's plenty of shirts like this. There's T-shirts, as Alex said. There's long-sleeve T-shirts. There's hats. There's hoodies. There's stickers. There's all sorts of marvelous things. Alex, I know, is brimming with ideas for all sorts of other amazing products. In fact, we've been brainstorming together about them. So don't delay. Come and help the Duran. Help yourself. Go to our shop. Alex will tell you how to do it.
Link in the description box down below, theduranshop.com. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Until next time, everybody, take care.